Nixon! Okay, so Nixon was willing to get down and dirty. He used Red Scare tactics. So yeah, he was shy, and he was introverted, and he was humorless, and he was uncomfortable in social settings. He was incredibly driven and self-controlled and rigid and one-track minded, and he was skeptical and guarded, and he never felt accepted in Washington. So yeah. He was Eisenhower's vice president, and he was considered the Hatchetman, which basically means that he did Eisenhower's dirty work. No, Mac, he did not have a hatchet. For instance, he did the Goodwill Tour in Latin America, and during which he had rocks thrown at him. Latin America doesn't really like the U.S., and Nixon represented the U.S., so they got their revenge. He was also pro-Castro before Castro became communist, and understandably so. Once we get to the story about Castro, he's not that evil. So yeah. Anyway, in 1960, he ran against Kennedy, and he lost. It was the first televised presidential debate, and Nixon refused to wear makeup, and he was sick, whereas Kennedy was willing to wear makeup, so he looked significantly better. So those who listened on the radio were pro-Nixon, but those who actually watched on television were pro-Kennedy. From 1963 to 1965, there were very few protests against the Vietnam War because few even knew about it, and those who knew about it were the Vietnam War. The protests started in 1968 after the Tet Offensive. In 1968, Nixon was elected president, and he won because of the silent majority. This was the first time since Lincoln that the Southerners voted Republican, because they had been the Solid South. Nixon won by saying that he had a secret plan to get out of the war, when in reality he didn't really have a secret plan. His plan was essentially to rehash the previous plans. And he used something called the Madman Theory, where he would send members of the State Department to try to negotiate peace with North Vietnam. And the advisors told North Vietnam that Nixon was unstable. He was a crazy man. And anytime negotiations stalled, he performed bomb raids on Vietnam. This tactic failed, but it was creative. He also used Vietnamization, which was where Nixon tried to wean South Vietnam off of the U.S. help and to bring soldiers back home. And he thought that gradually the South Vietnam would fight for themselves. This was called the Nixon Doctrine. But, yeah. Spiro T. Agnew was Nixon's vice president, and he was known as Nixon's Nixon. So he was Nixon's Hatchetman. He was forced to resign in his second term for the discovery of scandals while he was governor, and Ford became the new vice president. Henry Kissinger was head of national security, and then he became the Secretary of State. Nguyen Van Thieu, again, I'm sorry, Frenchies, was put into power in South Vietnam as the U.S. was pulling out. And in 1970, Nixon announced that he'd extend the U.S. military mission. In April of 1970, he announced that ground troops would invade Cambodia, which was part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So the effects of this was that we enlarged our battlefield in Vietnam, and it also increased the U.S. protests. Protests were led by hippies, who were the baby boomers, and this is because they were the age group that was being sent over. Also, most protests took place at colleges and universities. In 1970, at Kent State University in Ohio, the Ohio National Guard was brought for crowd control, and chaos ensued, and 4 students were shot and killed. This increased the division in the U.S. When you start killing youth, people get angry, but they're also angry that the youth is protesting against the government. This just wasn't really done. Before Vietnam, there wasn't any protesting, and there wasn't any questioning of the government, or dodging the draft, but this started because of the Tet Offensive. In 1971, ping-pong diplomacy was used. Mao Zedong allowed Chinese national table tennis team to go to Japan for the international tournament. They hadn't been participating in things with other countries in years, so this was a huge deal. It's also where the ping-pong diplomacy comes into play, why it's called ping-pong diplomacy. Nixon sent Kissinger to Japan to negotiate a meeting between himself, Nixon, and Mao, and they came up with SALT I, which is the Strategic Arms Limitations Talks, and it limited weaponry, especially ICBMs, but it did not limit MIRVs, so little was really accomplished with it. MIRVs are multiple independent re-entry vehicles, which allowed intercontinental missiles to re-enter the atmosphere. Commercialization allowed the U.S. to win the Cold War. It gave a taste of American culture to the Vietnamese and the Soviet Union, and the people wanted more. When you start drinking Coke and things like that, you start thinking, hey, maybe the U.S. isn't so bad, or at least we don't like our country and we want to change it. So, yeah. Nixon's visits to China and the Soviet Union also furthered the Sino-Soviet split, which is a good thing. In Nixon's second term, he used Kissinger, the Secretary of State, to implement the Madman Theory and negotiate peace. Linebacker II was the primary North Vietnamese negotiator, and in 1972, Nixon visited China and began negotiating further trade with China. He also visited Moscow to negotiate trade with the Soviet Union, and he was the first president to visit China or the Soviet Union, so that's pretty big. In October of 1972, Kissinger announced that peace was at hand, and he said this because 1972 was an election year. It wasn't actually because peace was at hand. Nixon was reelected and immediately announced that there was a stall in peace negotiation and that he would implement Operation Linebacker II. Operation Linebacker II was where they would start sending ground troops to Cambodia, which was part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and this failed. In December of the same year, the U.S. announced that they would work towards peace, and it was legitimate this time because everything was failing. In December, wait, I just said that, I'm sorry. On January 27th of 1973, they signed an agreement ending U.S. involvement, and that's the end of the Vietnam War. The first agreement was that they would return all POWs immediately, and secondly, they said that they would complete U.S. military evacuation within 2 months. In April of 1975, Nguyen Van Thieu, I'm sorry, Frenchies, publicly blasted the U.S. for evacuating and leaving him, and then he immediately fled. South Vietnam fell to communism, and Vietnam was unified. Vietnam experienced high inflation and unemployment, and had nothing economic to offer, and had a corrupt government. Basically, it was not good. Yeah. Soviet Union and China didn't help Vietnam at all. Firstly, the Soviet Union and China were not hell-bent on spreading communism to Vietnam, and by 1973, the Soviet Union and China had internal problems of their own to deal with, and so they weren't really that interested. Cambodia soon became communist too, and then Laos. Now, what Nixon was actually known for: the Watergate Scandal, which occurred at the Democratic National Headquarters, or with them, and the Committee to Re-elect the President, also known as CREEP, C-R-E-E-P. Not sure where the second E comes from, but that's okay. Some people involved in CREEP broke into the Democratic National Headquarters and they took pictures of papers, and they got caught. Nixon didn't know about it, but when he found out after, he helped cover it up. They listened to the tapes from the Oval Office. Nixon recorded every conversation in the office so that he could accurately write his autobiography. And they found out about him trying to hide it. And he resigned before he could be impeached. Impeachment just means you go on trial, not actually that you're kicked out of the office. So yeah. So there are some reasons for Nixon's policies. For one, he believed in the domino theory. Secondly, he believed in peaceful coexistence, which was the reasons for his visits to China and the Soviet Union. He also believed that Ho Chi Minh's closest allies were China and the Soviet Union, so he hoped that the visits would put pressure on North Vietnam. Number 4, in 1972 there was an election, and so the visits would look good to voters. Fifth, Kissinger had connections and was liked by the media, but he wasn't much of a politician, and Nixon was the reverse. Nixon was a huge politician, but he wasn't very well liked by the media, and he didn't have many connections, so they worked well together. They complemented each other nicely. And number 6, Nixon wanted to end the war because that's what the public wanted, and without doing what the public wants, you're not going to get votes, and without votes you don't get to be reelected, and that's just ruining your political career. Yay! Now, because I don't have much information on Ford, because he's not that important, I guess, I'm just going to include him in this video because he's kind of related to Nixon anyway, since he's the vice president, and he took over when Nixon resigned. So, let's go with Ford. Ford was Nixon's vice president. He was a moderate Republican and not an extremist, and his goal was to restore the luster to the presidency. He pardoned Nixon, and so he was never elected. He pardoned Nixon even though the public wanted him tried, because Ford believed that having a former president's name dragged through the mud was not what the U.S. needed, so he basically took the fall for the U.S. In 1976, Ford ran for president, and he lost to Jimmy Carter, who was from Georgia.